And our next speaker, Mr. Richard Alex Roehrl, he will share with us about the role of digital technology in a green and sustainable post-pandemic recovery, another very important area in our life today. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Fu and Professor Gowrie. I'm really humbled and honored to be here today and join you in this great discussion. On a personal note, it's been 3 decades ago. I used to read physics at the University of Oxford, so I'm a little emotional today, so bear with me. I also have to confess that even though I became an economist and I've worked for a long time for the UN and supported governments, I am still in my heart a scientist, so you will see that. So let me share my slides. I managed to do this. It's moved again. F5. Okay, can you see it?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I was asked to provide a global science policy perspective on digital technologies and the post-pandemic recovery. And so I will first tell you a little bit about UN science policy work, and I draw some lessons from the pandemic, and then give some very specific example on what some of the things that Sonia just talked about, the AI revolution and so on, what aspects from an assessment and science policy point of view you might want to take into account in looking at digital technologies and online platforms going forward. So if you ever get to UN headquarters, you may want to walk down the line of flagpoles of 193 UN member states. These countries are all different with their own history, culture, development aspirations, yet individual lives in these countries, they're ever closer interlinked in a myriad of ways. And this is the starting point of building a science policy society interface. And at a very global level, we work at the United Nations. In 2015, world leaders set themselves 17 aspirational goals, the so-called Sustainable Development Goals. You will have heard about them. And science and technology is at the heart of many of the solutions to these challenges. Digital technologies, of course, play a role for all of them. And that is why UN member states have created these new entry points for scientists and engineers from private sector, academia, and civil society to get engaged. The most notably here, the technology facilitation mechanism. It consists of an STI forum where people come together. It brings together 43 UN entities that work in 10 work streams. They undertake also crowdsourcing of experts, external experts. There's a group of 10 high-level representatives of science, civil society, and private sector, researchers, innovators, and so on. They're engaged in this, and you will see in the picture Professor Fu, a member of the first such group. So we work closely with her, and we're very glad for all her contributions, especially also for the creation of an online platform under this mechanism called 2030 Connect, which aims to bring together technology suppliers and users, some kind of matchmaking at a very high level. And I hope that many of the platform activities that we hear here today, they will become part of a bigger ecosystem that will be interlinked in the future. So how have you fared? Why all this emphasis on science and technology? Quite simply, our global science policy track record has been dismal, I would say. This graph shows data from the European Environment Agency for things like lead, acid rain, tobacco, climate change. It shows a time lags from the early scientific warning to policy action and to impact and harm reduction. And you can see this is on the order of decades to 1 century. So I guess we can do better. But there's some reasons for why our science policy track record has been underwhelming. And one of them is known as the knowledge paradox. I love this illustration from Robert Dijkgraaf. It shows that as society has become more educated, it has become infinitesimally close to science, yet infinitely far away due to ever more specialization in the sciences. So we need integrators. I like this quote from Niels Bohr that says, an expert is a man who has made all the mistakes that can be made in a narrow field. This, of course, how science progresses through falsification, but we need those integrated, and digital technologies play an important role in this regard. When COVID struck in 2020, we wrote a policy brief called A Wake-Up Call for Better Cooperation at the Science Policy Society Interface. And it was also triggered by some eminent science advisor calling these catastrophic failures of the science policy interface that we've seen in the spring of 2020. I leave it up to you whether you agree. But in this brief, I encourage you to have a look. We have recommendations in 5 different areas. I don't need to go through them. They're sort of common sense, but I think for this discussion here is very important that all these things like capacities, public trust, sharing knowledge for collaborative research, universal access, and global scientific assessments are all interlinked and mediated through this emerging ecosystem of digital technologies and platforms. Okay, so let me go a little further. One of the items was assessment. So I want to say a little bit about the impacts of ICTs, new internet applications, and this AI revolution on the global energy demand, and why this may be an issue that should be taken into account in some way in the design of all those online platforms to make a real difference. I wrote a paper a year ago or so based on empirical evidence and bringing things together from expert surveys. They showed clearly that the significant increasing energy demand of the internet, and especially most recently driven by AI and big data applications, I showed the fundamental efficiency limits of computing in various dimensions. Many of the smart efficiency increasements of smart systems are way more outweighed by entirely new services that are being created, and some of them we heard today. The result of this is, of course, on a global level, accelerated increased future energy demand, regardless of what we do with smart systems to increase overall global energy demands. So this calls for some responses. So let me just highlight a few examples. It's of course because of the big numbers. We've heard some of those, so I don't have to go through all of them, but really we have 2/3, by some estimates, this month, 2/3 of world population as internet users, 2.7 billion Facebook users, and so on and so on. You know, like 265 billion emails just sent today, internet traffic of something like 9.4 billion gigabyte per day. Every day, more than 4 million smartphones are being sold, and so on. So these are staggering numbers. But what do we do in our private life? So have you ever thought about your Google search? The Google search nowadays, there are a wide range of estimates, but you know, good estimate is 15 watt hours of electricity being used for each Google search, and 1 gram of CO2 contributed. This is similar to boiling half an electric water kettle. There's a hot stuff here, right? So imagine 7.6 billion Google searches today by 1 billion users. So it all adds up. What about the hot deep neural network systems? So training, one of the state-of-the-art that actually gets to human level performance, it's been estimated it took about 656 megawatt hours and produced 313 tons CO2 equivalents. So this is similar to the CO2 emissions of 5 passenger cars over their entire lifetime. Okay, so these are not purely virtual things here, and they compare, you know, as they replace cognitive tasks, they replace humans. humans are highly energy efficient. Their brains of 25 watt brain can solve the same thing in about a few seconds. You see the same thing in self-driving cars. They have cooling systems and so on. You hear often the great progress, and there's a big progress. Take smartphone. Digital convergence shows that a smartphone brings together, more than 20 other devices that have been brought together, and it really embodied energy down by factor 23, power down by 90 times, and so on. But when you look at the overall numbers, then the life cycle-based energy embodied in all these smartphones per average year of use was actually 30% larger than that of passengers' cars in 2015. So this is not negligible and is only growing. So what about the overall energy use then of the internet? In 2019, we estimated it would be about 2,000 terawatt hours, and most of which, of course, the consumer devices, but probably is very much higher, because we know that from February to mid-April, internet traffic grew by some 40%, and energy data movement is basically energy demand. What about some of the companies that we heard here? So estimates are not terribly good, but you can see up to 2017-18, you have exponential growth in electricity use of these companies. And thereafter, it's accelerating. I can't put in many estimates, but by some estimates, Amazon Web Services 2% of electricity consumption in the US, there will be something like 80 terawatt hours, way beyond what we see here. YouTube. And next time you see your kid watching YouTube movies, you might tell them whether they could consider doing this on a fixed line. You can see here the biggest share by far is the cellular mobile network. But the cellular mobile network is, of course, has all these other advantages. It's all these services that we're talking about that are value added and that help development. But that is why, it is something that's known to hardware producers, of course. And so this shows supercomputer performance. Just to show you there's some limits. Why we're talking about AI is, of course, because in 2014 we had the first time a top supercomputer with 20 petaflops, which is similar roughly to a human brain. So, but this continues to grow exponentially, whereas we had a breakdown of Moore's law, and they're not scaling in normal computers. So this continues, and if you look into the future, where is it? Okay, so in the future, this would mean by 2025, the top supercomputer about 500 brains. By 2030, maybe 10,000, and by 2040, about 700,000 brains. And of course, this is not just one of these computers, but a network that's increasingly becoming a serious contender to overall contribution to global energy demand. Okay, I can go on efficiency. Also, okay, efficiency, there's lots of improvement, factor 10 every 5 years or so in efficiencies. But the problem is, as I said before, silicon computing is highly energy inefficient still, with some very few exceptions of co-design of hardware software for very low energy robotics that's emerging nowadays. So they're factor 10,000 to 100,000 times lower efficiency than human brains. Maybe organic computers will make a difference to this in the coming years, but we don't know when and how. So this avalanche is starting. And, it's not that you don't have to look at the details here. It's not that integrated assessment models haven't looked at this. They have, of course, focused on what could be done with all of this and increasing efficiencies and reducing demand. And there's some highly ambitious scenarios like this Yaja low energy demand scenarios, it reduces by 40% over the next few decades overall global energy demand, despite wealth increases and so on. But it leaves open some of these questions. Early action might be needed on some of the platforms. We can look at scenarios. We've done that bottom up and from with various methodologies, especially using data from Andre and Edler, who's done some pioneering work there. But regardless how you look at it, from now to 2030, ICT power use will increase. There's absolutely no doubt about it, and it will increase several fold. So I'm running out of time here. So I had an example of citizen science, here where, let me just say as much as this, the screenshots at the bottom show what some users do in the PhotoQuest Go Europe, where they get rewarded for checking out locations and using their smartphone just to take photos, and they can earn money like this. And I was thinking that's much cheaper than, the professional land use systems, a factor 10 or so. So I could imagine that in developing countries, some of these things on platforms or maybe added to some of the platforms could be useful. So let me wrap up here. In summary, the pandemic has really further accelerated a digitalization trend that was already accelerating before. So some of the things I showed was before the pandemic. The sheer number of users and devices and the AI revolution call for making energy efficiency and GHG emissions design elements in digital technologies. I believe we need incentive structures for this efficiency, and you could turn them around and make them business opportunities just as well. Online platforms, there are markets for this. Online platforms could also become catalysts for a better science policy society interface, which could also make the platforms useful in a much broader sense. And just to pick up the citizen science example here again, I think there could be a source of income on some of these platforms. So thank you very much. I finish with this sculpture of the Notre Dame, a gun, just saying that the UN works for peace. And ultimately, I think in cooperating and exchanging views and knowledge is exactly about that. Thank you.